That is the way we should feel when our lives crash because of sin. We should examine what has gone wrong. We should set up an internal investigatory team in our conscience and search out our heart to discover sin, to drag it out, to arraign it before our eyes, and to nail it to the cross of Calvary.
The fear of man bringeth a snare, but he who puts his trust in the Lord shall be safe. Proverbs 29:25. This week, on Doctrine for Life, Dr. Joel Beeke recounts the way Abraham fell back into an old sin when he feared man more than God in the first part of his sermon on Genesis 20. To enjoy more resources from the pen and pulpit of Dr. Beeke, please visit joelbeeke.org.
When we come to a new year, dear congregation, we often have to face old experiences, old sins, old obstacles, as well as the joy of old promises. And Genesis 20 and 21 consist of 3 such episodes in the life of Abraham that hark back to his past. In the chapter before us this morning, he falls into an old sin of telling the surrounding heathen that Sarah was his sister. And in the next chapter, verses 1 through 7, chapter 21, God will fulfill an old promise, finally giving Isaac to Abraham and Sarah. And then in verses 8 through 20 of chapter 1, God will revive an old controversy, which will result in Abraham sending Hagar and Ishmael away. So in chapter 20, there's the return of an old sin. In chapter 21, there's the realization of an old promise, and then the removal of an old obstacle. And all 3 of these events have many practical lessons to convey to us as we enter a new year. This morning we limit ourselves to the first of them, to Genesis 20, and God willing, in future weeks we hope to look at the others as well. So our text this morning is Genesis 20, and I will read again at this time only verse 3. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, Behold, thou art but a dead man, for the woman which thou hast taken, for she is a man's wife. With God's help, our theme this morning is the return of an old sin. We'll see that in 2 thoughts. First, Abraham's serious fall, and second, God's overruling grace. The return of an old sin, Abraham's serious fall, God's overruling grace. Abraham fell. He fell into serious failure in Genesis 20, which once again makes us be able to identify with this man, this godly man, this friend of God, falls into an old sin. And how often don't we fall into old sins? And so immediately this morning, we can identify with Abraham, and we feel, even implicitly, don't we, there is much for us to learn from this chapter, from Abraham's fall. And the question that faces us at the outset is this: what led Abraham to repeat this old sin and to run the risk again of bringing harm to Sarah and to others? What things were going awry in his life that would lend itself to being able to fall again the same way that he had fallen 25 to 30 years ago and gotten in so much trouble for it? Well, this is worthy of our investigation, isn't it? Boys and girls, when a plane crashes, a team of investigation is set up to look for the reason why. And when they find the reason why, they try to find ways to solve the problem for the future. That is the way we should feel when our lives crash because of sin. We should examine what has gone wrong. We should set up an internal investigatory team in our conscience and search out our heart to discover sin, to drag it out, to arraign it before our eyes, and to nail it to the cross of Calvary. What motivates such foolish behavior? Well, obviously, Abraham's life here is crashing in on him. And there are reasons why he was susceptible at this time. And I'll just give you three of them briefly. First of all, Abraham was discouraged. And discouragement is a time of susceptibility. Sodom and Gomorrah had just been destroyed by God. And Abraham had just, you recall, walked to the spot where he had before met the Lord and prayed that God would spare Sodom and Gomorrah if there were even 10 righteous. And no doubt he's downcast that there weren't even 10 righteous in these cities. And so he grieves for Sodom. But also he's discouraged by it. He's discouraged, no doubt, by Lot's behavior and by Lot's family. He has flashbacks, perhaps, of Lot's lingering and of Lot's wife turning to a pillar of salt and the sons-in-law rejecting the word of God, and Lot himself seems so far from God. Abraham was already very much alone in his worship of God in the area, and now he's discouraged. And in his discouragement, he decides to move on. And he goes all the way to Gerar, which would later become a center of the Philistines. He goes down to the southwest corner of the Promised Land, to the Arab kingdom of Gerar. And there, it appears, secondly, that he becomes depressed. His discouragement leads, as it were, to despair, to a depressing view of Gerar. Abraham has many fears as he comes into Gerar. He's afraid that they will take Sarah and kill him. Sarah was a beautiful woman, even though she was elderly, and that they would destroy Abraham. And so out of unbelief, he concocts this continual plan with Sarah, that wherever they would go, she would say, "He's my brother." And Abraham has fears here that allow that plan to continue. He puts on his dark-colored glasses, and he sees everything in a depressive way. In fact, it seems he views Gerar as another Sodom, as another den of iniquity, another cesspool of evil. Even though Gerar really wasn't all that bad. It was a stable and peaceful society. True, they didn't worship God, but they had a conscientious and a generous king. And his government and officials seemed to be honest men. But Abraham doesn't see that. He sees everything in the darkest possible way. He doesn't see the common grace of God operating in Gerar. That's what happens to people when they get depressed. They see everything in a very dark way. Everything looks black. Everything looks discouraging. Abraham is filled with a haunting suspicion, a depressive suspicion of everything associated with Gerar. He says in verse 11 to Abimelech, I thought, not God thought, I thought, surely the fear of God is not in this place, and they will slay me for my wife's sake. Well, we can learn from Abraham here that this is a danger we need to be aware of. Yes, the world is an evil place, but there is also common grace in this world. And sometimes True Christians, especially first-generation Christians, don't see that you can move about in this world and see some good, at least some outward civil good. There is relative truth and beauty and goodness in this world. Unbelievers can compose beautiful music or beautiful works of art. Unbelieving scientists can discover medicines that God uses to heal our bodies. We meet unbelievers in our daily lives who have noble characters like Abimelech, who have unselfish characters, helpful characters. Sometimes there are certain unbelievers that we'd rather associate with almost than certain professing Christians. They seem easier to deal with. So we must not fall into Abraham's depressing exaggeration of the darkness of everything in this world. Someone put it this way. They said, Lot erred in one way by imagining there was some good in Sodom when there was none. But Abraham erred in the opposite way by imagining there was no good in Gerar when there was much. So we need to learn, as we enter a new year and face the world and all that it involves, we need to learn to flee from worldliness, despise everything that's sinful, yes indeed, but we also need to learn to appreciate what is civilly good in this world, and not to see everything in black and white and in depressing terms. But thirdly, what made Abraham susceptible to fall was not only his discouragement and his depression, but especially his disbelief. He was disbelieving. He had a lack of faith here in the promises and power of God. God had said to him, I will keep you, I will protect you wherever you go. I am God Almighty. And here again, Abraham is taking things into his own hands. And what a lesson this is for us. You see, it's one thing to say, yes, I believe the doctrines of grace. I believe what God says. It's another thing to put it into practical use. If you said to Abraham, do you believe the promises of God? He'd say yes. And yet he goes about devising his own safety mechanisms that implicitly say, I don't think God's going to protect me in Gerar. I've got to do something myself. Sarah, tell people that you're my sister. Well, it's easy for us to judge Abraham, but I think we do the same thing many times, don't we? We say we believe in prayer. We say that prayer is important, that prayer must come first. We believe it. But how often do we go other places rather than prayer when need arises? And how much time do we really spend on our knees, believing in the power of prayer? We say we believe that when we witness for Christ, God will uphold us. God will use our words. But how often do we shut our mouths when we have opportunities to proclaim His name? We say that we believe that God is in control over our lives, in control over our suffering, in control over our disappointment, that He numbers the hairs of our head. But how often we complain and murmur and don't believe, yes, even insult God with our disbelieving demeanor. Well, you see, when these three things come together, discouragement, depression, unbelief, we're prone to fall. We're prone to go our own way. We're prone to fail. We're prone to engage in sin.
Let's take a quick break.
You're listening to the All of Life for God podcast from Reformation Heritage Books. Use the code ALG at checkout to save 10% on your next order.
Live as if you thought that Christ might come at any time. 19th century evangelical leader J.C. Ryle knew that there was only one way to prepare for Christ's return, to put on the Lord Jesus Christ in every aspect of our lives. Now you can take up this charge daily with Our Great Redeemer, a new 365-day devotional featuring excerpts from J.C. Ryle's sermons. This compilation of 365 powerful readings from Ryle's preaching and writing is rich with grace, truth, and conviction that defined Ryle's ministry. Order Our Great Redeemer today at the link in our show notes.
What is the chief end of man? To glorify God and enjoy Him forever. For centuries, the Westminster Shorter Catechism has helped Christians, young and old, to know their chief end. William Boekestein, Jonathan Landry Cruz, and Andrew J. Miller's insightful devotional, Glorifying and Enjoying God, introduces a new generation to its powerful message in 52 short chapters. Visit heritagebooks.org/glorifying to learn more.
Thousands of sermons, dozens of books, commentaries, and devotionals, decades of faithful ministry. By God's grace, the fruit of Charles Spurgeon's ministry is bountiful. But do you know the man behind the ministry? In Spurgeon, A Life, Alex de Prima paints a fresh portrait of the most well-known gospel minister of the 19th century. Combining academic expertise with popular presentation, this biography of the Prince of Preachers is the best modern introduction to Spurgeon's ministry. Learn more at the link in our show notes.
I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes. Romans 1, verse 16. This truth is at the heart of Paul Washer's Christ-exalting preaching. From the Recovering the Gospel series to the Preeminent Christ, Washer's works call believers and unbelievers alike to behold the Savior in the gospel. Explore the writings of Paul Washer, published exclusively by Reformation Heritage Books, by visiting heritagebooks.org/paulwasher. Thanks for listening to the All of Life for God podcast. Don't forget to enter the code ALG to save 10% on your next order with Reformation Heritage Books.
Oh, you say that may all be well and good, but why was Abraham's sin so serious? After all, Sarah was his half-sister. He just didn't tell all the truth. He was just being mildly devious. Was it really that bad? And didn't God rescue him? Well, of course, God rescued him. God is gracious. But that doesn't mean we can take Abraham's fall lightly. There are several things here that indicate that Abraham's sin is actually a very serious thing indeed. And the first is this: Abraham dallies with old sin. And whenever we play with old sin, we are committing serious sin. This is a sin for which Abraham has already been rebuked. Way back in Genesis 12, you remember, when he told in Egypt the same lie and got in essentially the same trouble. Sarah was taken into a harem, and God wonderfully protected her. Now, of course, some Old Testament liberal scholars will tell us this is really the same story. Genesis 12, Genesis 20, and the original writer of the Bible just forgot that he'd recorded the story and he did it again in a different setting. And, well, that's nonsense, of course. Sometimes you wonder whether these liberal scholars know anything about their own hearts. Haven't you ever committed the same sin twice? Of course you have. So have I. And what fools we are for doing so. When we got in trouble the first time and repented, and yet we fell into it again. You see, the worst thing here is that Abraham and Sarah apparently had this plan arranged that wherever they would go, it was a contract a compact. Verse 13 says, God caused me to wander from my father's house so that I would say to my wife, this is your kindness to me, Sarah, which you shall show to me at every place whither we shall come. Say of me, he's my brother. He's my brother. Abraham is being extraordinarily self-absorbed, self-centered, self-interested in this compact. It's almost as if he doesn't care what happens to his dear Sarah, whether she goes to a harem or not, only as long as he is spared. Well, what a sin is that? And it's all based on his own thinking. His self-absorption skews his thinking. He says, I thought. He doesn't take it to the Lord, does he? This is our problem too, friends. Whenever we fall into old sin, I thought. We have our excuses. Instead of saying, Lord, how can I honor thee today? Even if it means self-denial. Even if it means my suffering. How can I honor thee? How can I walk in thy ways? How can I extend thy kingdom today? Forgetting ourselves, giving honor to God. That's our calling. Today, of course, the whole world around us has the opposite calling. Everybody talks about self-esteem instead of Christ-esteem. Christ-esteem is what we need, friends. We need to live for Him and not for ourselves. We need to be absorbed into His kingdom. We need to be concerned about what happens to His name and His reputation. We need to be freed from our self-absorption. Actually, you'd expect Abraham to do the opposite here, wouldn't you? You'd expect him to say, Sarah, my dear, we must make a plan as we go from place to place that will at all costs protect you from being abused by people and by kings. You're a beautiful woman. And if it means shedding my life's blood for you to protect you, I will gladly shed it that you might be safe. You'd expect that kind of God-fearing loyalty from a God-fearing man, wouldn't you? But instead, Sarah is secondary and Abraham is placed in the front. And Abraham is so far gone in this sin, so backslidden in this sin, that he tells Abimelech, as if he doesn't even feel anything wrong with it. He says, this is our plan wherever we went. He has become calloused in this sin. Boys and girls, you know what it's like to get calluses on your hand, don't you? If you work hard, you get calluses all right here on your hand or on your fingers. And your hands, your fingers get hard there. You can even pick them with a pin in it, and it doesn't hurt. Well, that's what happens to us when we keep falling into the same old sin. We get harder. We get calloused in our conscience. And pretty soon, before you know it, we don't even think it's too bad anymore. We even dare to be open about it. Down in Florida the other week, I was talking a few minutes to a lady, and she said, my partner, this and that. She said something about the partner, and later I met her partner, and her partner was a girl. They were lesbians, and she just was totally unashamed of it. She had become callous to her sin. She said, my whole family's deserted me. But this is my choice of lifestyle. That's an extreme case, of course. But Abraham is in the wrong place here, isn't he? He doesn't even hardly see his sin. How dangerous it is as we enter a new year to drag old sins into the new year with us and to become complacent with those old sins. Oh, that God would open our eyes to see the seriousness of every sin and to search them out. That we might cry out to God in the beginning of this year, search me, O God, and know my heart, and try my way, and show me my sin, and help me to root them out and lead me in the way everlasting. Help me to nail those sins to the cross of death, to put the sword through sin, not to dally with sin anymore. Oh, wretched man that I am, deliver me, O God, from the body of this death. Friends, don't minimize your old sins. Don't get calloused under them. Don't trivialize them. Don't dumb them down. The fact that they're old sins makes them all the worse. Makes you all the more guilty. Don't rest until you see those sins arraigned before your eyes, until you detest them and kill them by the grace of God. Well, that's Abraham's first problem. He's dealing with sin. His second problem is he dishonors the plan and covenant promise of God. He dishonors the plan and covenant promise of God. Chapter 18:10 says, I will certainly return unto thee according to the time of life, and lo, Sarah thy wife shall have a son. Now it's to be 1 year from that time. Sarah is apparently pregnant already at this point. And in her pregnancy lies the core of the covenant promise, lies the future Isaac, and through Isaac lies the line of generations unto the coming of the Messiah. You can say it this way with reverence, that the gospel, the heart of the gospel for all future ages is really laying in Sarah's womb. And yet Abraham, at this critical time of Sarah's life and his own life, is willing to give her over to another man, to resign rights to his own wife, and said, she's my sister. Abraham, what are you doing? How can you be so foolish? Are you trying to tinker with the covenant promise of God? Did you forget that Sarah is to be the mother of the promised child and of the birth of the Messiah, ultimately? You see, Abraham is risking God's plan. Suppose Sarah had been taken unto Abimelech, physically, intimately, and later on she would have this child. What would people say? Well, you know what people would say. They'd say, well, this woman's been married to Abraham for decades. They could never have a baby. Now she went into Abimelech, and now she has a baby. Who's the father? The answer is obvious. But Abraham is risking that to save his own skin. And behind it, he's risking the gospel promises, the plan of God. He's even willing to cast a shadow of doubt over the birth of Isaac, the son of promise. He's bringing a blight, at very least, upon the gospel itself. That's a serious sin. God help us from being blights upon his gospel. But thirdly, Abraham endangers other people. He endangers other people. Look at the worry and distress that his sin brings to other people. He's imperiling the purity, perhaps even the life of his wife. And remember, Abraham's not a novice here. By this time, he's an exercised child of God. He's been face to face with God. He's a friend of God. And yet here we see him falling into this dreadful deceitfulness and selfishness, endangering his dear Sarah at the most precarious time of her life. At the same time, he's endangering Abimelech and his entire household. His sin brings barrenness on the whole household. Barrenness, remember, at that time was a serious curse. It also brought worry and fear and distress to Abimelech's household, and perhaps sickness too. We read that he and his household were very much afraid, and God had to heal them in the end. So Abraham's concern, you see, causes confusion. It causes endangerment, anxiety, harm to many people. And of course, that's the nature of sin. That's what sin always does. That's always the end result of sin. Sin creates confusion, and confusion reaps danger. Our sin always has a wider net than we imagine. Its tentacles go out and reach more people than we imagine. It claims victims. Sometimes as a consistory, when we sit around and talk about a certain case, sometimes we don't know how to handle it, where to go from here. It's not easy because sin brings confusion. Sin isn't easy to handle. Sometimes we have to look at each other and say, Sin just wreaks havoc. You have the same thing in your family, don't you? If a family member falls into sin, what damage sin can do to a whole family. Oh, that it would be your prayer and keep me from endangering other people because of my selfish sin.
Thank you for listening to Doctrine for Life with Dr. Joel Beeke. If you were encouraged by this episode and would like to hear more, please consider subscribing and sharing with a friend. To enjoy more resources from the pen and pulpit of Dr. Beeke, please visit joelbeeke.org.